It's another cable show about God. Your host is Dr. Craig Johnson, pastor of Bethel Christian Fellowship in Agoura Hills and professor in residence at Chalcedon Christian Academy.
Today I want to talk about Bethlehem, a city of hope. Did you ever wonder why Jesus was born in Bethlehem? We're going to find out this morning that there's no more sacred geography than the city of Bethlehem. There's no more of a perfect place for the Messiah to have been born. And by the end of this little message today, you're going to know why Bethlehem was chosen to be the city of the great King. Now, the text that we're quoting from is from Micah chapter 5, verse 2. But thou, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall he come forth unto me that is to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been from old, from everlasting. Now, this is a prophecy about one specific city. And we always sing, O little town of Bethlehem, or we speak about the Star of Bethlehem, but we need to know why. There are actually 5 reasons why Bethlehem was a perfect place for the Messiah to be born. The first reason was the name. The name. Bethlehem means the house of bread. Did you know Bethlehem was a magnificent place? On the hills you could find the goats and the sheep grazing. In the shades of the trees, you would find the finest vineyards. Did you know Bethlehem produced the finest wine, much better than Jerusalem 5 miles away? And there were pomegranates, and there were olives, and there were dates, and Bethlehem was literally a house of bread. It was known as a place of wealth for farmers from time immemorial. In Ruth chapter 2, verse 1, read the whole book of Ruth. They were inhabitants. Boaz was a man from Bethlehem. Bethlehem meant the house of bread. It spoke of a place of abundance, and it was in this very city where God the Son, second person of the Trinity, assumed human flesh so that he literally could be broken and be given as the bread of the world. Bethlehem, the house of bread, perfect name for a perfect place because Jesus was the bread who came down from heaven. Literally, all the hunger, the spiritual hunger from the entire beginning of time until that time, that hunger was met in the city and the house of bread through he who was the bread from heaven. In John chapter 6, Jesus said, I'm the bread that came down from heaven. He said, you remember the manna that came down every day for 40 years to the children of Israel? He said, well, I am the fulfillment of that. So it's perfect that he was born in Bethlehem, the house of bread. The hunger of the ages met in that beautiful place, and that's where God became flesh. It's just a majestic thing. And as I pointed out before, it's wonderful to look at creation and be overawed at the majesty and the power of God. But when we look at Bethlehem, we see that he came a little baby thing that made a woman cry. This little sweet, precious gift from heaven. It's just almost counterintuitive that a king would come and be so vulnerable, that the master was in the manger, that literally the one who gave the 10 commandments was wrapped in swaddling clothes. It's beyond our understanding, but it's appropriate that he was born in the house of bread. Well, the second reason Bethlehem was significant is because of the tomb of Rachel. Now, this is very interesting. The book of Genesis tells us in Genesis 48:7 that Jacob, his beloved wife Rachel, I don't know if you know the Bible story, but one of the greatest romances in the Bible is Jacob and Rachel. He was crazy about Rachel. Rachel was the love of his life. She was a little kooky, but she was the love of his life. And he worked 7 years for her, and it says it seemed as but a day for the great love that he had for her. And then he worked another 7 years for her. And Rachel became the symbol of the center and focus of Jacob's life. But she died, and his grief was so great in her death that he buried her near Bethlehem. It said, on the way to Ephrathah, Bethlehem, the tomb of Rachel was there. And it represented great love and great loss. Well, it's very interesting. Did you remember when Jesus was born that King Herod, who was ruling under the emperor of Rome at that time, ordered that all the children in Bethlehem should be killed from 2 years and under? Do you remember that? Isn't it funny that there's blood stains near the manger? That the story of the birth of the Messiah involves sorrow. Not only is he born in Bethlehem, the house of bread, he's the bread from heaven, but secondly, there was great sorrow. Literally, The tomb of Rachel represented all the sorrows that came down throughout the history of Israel, all of the loss, all of the trauma, all of the pain. And literally, Rachel's tomb represented, near Bethlehem, the terrible difficulties that the children of Israel had endured. The prophet Jeremiah, in his day, wrote a verse that is quoted by Matthew. In Ramah there was heard a voice of weeping, Rachel weeping for her children, and she would not be comforted because they were no more. Matthew seizes on Jeremiah's reference to Rachel and her tomb, and he says, when the babies were being killed through the order of Herod, it brings us near to the fact that Jesus was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. His very birth not only involved the singing of angels announcing he had arrived, but also announcing that the Messiah would be born, involved with the deepest sorrow imaginable. In Jeremiah's day, all of the children were being taken from Jerusalem northward towards exile. The mothers were losing their children forever. They would never see their babies again. Can you imagine your children in chains being dragged in front of you, taken north, past Rachel's tomb? And Jeremiah seizes on that imagery of mothers losing their children, that imagery of inconsolable grief. Have you ever been unconsolable? Have you ever been so broken that you wept and wept and wept until you had no more strength and you did not know what to do? Well, it's interesting. Bethlehem was the house of bread, but it was also a place of sorrow. Because of Rachel's tomb, there's also a tenor of loss and grief. Literally, Rachel is seen as weeping over her children, and she would not be comforted. Well, this is an interesting fact. The Messiah is not distant from trouble. Now, I don't know about you, but I was raised in Christian circles where we were supposed to have victory all the time. Nobody talked about trouble. Nobody talked about sin. Nobody talked about what was really going on in their life. No one really talked about real stuff. It was just sort of, we used to say, super good and getting better. How you doing? Super good and getting better. Your hair's on fire, your wife's left you, your kids are gone, but you're super good and getting better. Well, that can be denial sometimes. When people ask you how you're doing, you don't need to give them a sob story, but you do need to reflect some reality in what you're saying. And all the people said, I don't want to quit to preaching and go to meddling, but, just because you're a believer and belong to God does not mean you're not going to go through hard times. We're all going to go through hard times, but it's how we cope with the hard times. We get the lemons, we make the lemonade. I heard one preacher told me, said, someone could take the hand that was dealt to you and win with it. As much as you're complaining about the hand that's been dealt to you, someone else would love to have that hand and play it and win with it. But here's the point. I never realized that the birth of Jesus overlaps Rachel's tomb, the imagery of sorrow. God is acknowledging, I know you hurt. I know that you're inconsolable. I know things happen that are unspeakable, and you can't figure out why God allowed them. But I'm the Messiah who was born and put in swaddling clothes right in the middle of the story of Herod killing the little children to bring you to a fact that I understand the deepest pain. And Jesus literally says, I am your consolation. You're not going to be weeping without consolation. I will be your Savior, and I'll meet you at the deepest point of your need. So one reason why he was born in Bethlehem is just the name of it, the house of bread. He is the bread from heaven. Secondly, the tomb of Rachel. Now, isn't that interesting? When you think about this, God strategically planned Bethlehem. It was the perfect landing spot for the Messiah. The third reason why it was important, if you notice, it was a sacred name. It was the grave of Rachel, but the third, it was the home of Ruth. So we see bread, we see sorrow, and now we're going to see world horizon. We're going to see a God who accepts outcasts. I don't know if you know what the book of Ruth is. It's in the Old Testament. It's a really interesting story. There was a woman named Ruth, and she was married. There was a woman named Naomi, and she lived in Bethlehem. And she and her husband and family they made a mistake. About 30 miles east of Bethlehem is a mountain range called Moab. And the Moabites were people that you weren't to hang out with. The Moabites represented a people who you weren't supposed to intermarry with, you weren't supposed to deal with. And Naomi and her family decide that they're going to leave Bethlehem and they go to Moab. Well, long story short, Naomi loses everything. Her husband dies, her sons die, she loses her daughters. Oh, her daughter-in-law, she's got two daughter-in-laws. She said, look, you guys, my life's gone bitter. And one of them named Ruth, and she's a little, what we would call a little heathen girl. All right? She doesn't belong to the children of Israel. She's what we call an outcast. The Moabites were aliens. They were not allowed to be part of the covenant blessing of God's people. But you know, Ruth said to Naomi, Naomi, I know you've had setbacks, but I'm going to go with you to Bethlehem, because I want to know your God and I want to be a part of your people. The whole book of Ruth is this glorious story of Ruth, this outcast. We'd call her a heathen, little heathen girl. They're sometimes more interesting than the other ones. Did you know she was an alien? She's an outcast. In that day's culture, the children of Israel would have nothing to do with her. But listen, she comes to Bethlehem. And one of the greatest romances the Bible talks about. Read the book of Ruth later. Ladies, you're going to love that story. There's a guy named Boaz. He's a kinsman redeemer, and he comes into the picture, and he's a type of Christ who literally finds Ruth, this precious gift. And he accepts her as his own, and he marries her. And literally in Bethlehem, she becomes the ancestress of the Messiah. God takes this little outcast from Moab, and you may think you're a Moabite. You may not have been raised in the church world. You may not know God from a stump in the ground. Here's good news. Bethlehem represents God taking in everybody. See, sometimes we're a little too narrow. Did you know that? I'm sure you wouldn't think Christians are narrow. Heavens, no. But did you know our Messiah was universal? He said, I'm going to be born in Bethlehem to show that there is a universal call to everyone. I will accept Ruth's outcasts. I will accept people that have been in Moab. You may have been at Denim and Diamonds or the Moab Club. God will take you. He's universal in his acceptance. And so Bethlehem not only talks about bread, it talks about sorrow, the tomb of Rachel, but it talks about the world horizon. The Messiah is going to be interested in everybody. Don't you tell people that God just loves some people and not others. He loves everybody. Jesus died for everybody. I'm so excited I'm coughing. Did you know there's hope for you? It doesn't matter where you've been, little alien, little Moabite, Moabitus. It doesn't matter, because there's bread for you, even in the midst of sorrow. Jesus is the Messiah for you. And third, in World Horizon, everybody has a place. But here's the fourth reason why Bethlehem's important. It's important because of royal lineage. Do you know who was born in Bethlehem? King David. The greatest king in the history of Israel was a little boy in this city. Gorgeous David. He was a man's man. He was a woman's man. He was an author. He was a singer. He was a songwriter. He was a general. He was a king. He was amazing. He could play and sing. And I mean, he wrote the Psalms. This guy, talk about a tender warrior. This guy was all man and masculine, feminine. I mean, this guy embodied every grace that we can see. Do you know David's given more time than anyone in the Old Testament? You'd think Moses, we know more about Moses, or we know more about David, because he was just the centerpiece of biblical history for the children of Israel, and he was born in Bethlehem. And he grew up in Bethlehem. The house of Jesse, his father, was established. Samuel, the kingmaker, had to go to Bethlehem in order to anoint him with oil as the next king of Israel. What does the royal lineage have to do with it? God told David, he said, someday, David, I'm going to build a house, and the Messiah is going to come through your seed. David had a prophecy over his life that one day he and his lineage would produce the Messiah. Isn't it interesting? So we've got bread when we look at Bethlehem, the house of bread. We have sorrow, ancient sorrows, all summed up in one city, where the Messiah will be the consolation of that suffering. And third, we have World Horizon. We have Ruth born there, so anybody can come in, and he's going to save anyone to the uttermost. Fourth, royal lineage.